Hi Nat5s, so we are looking at the multicellular unit, and in particular we are looking at variation and inheritance. And to start off with, we're just going to look at the main terms that you need to know. Right, so variation. So variation is what we're talking about the entire time, so let's start off with the definition of that. And it's the differences that you have between individuals. So since we're looking at multicellular, we're looking at whole organisms. So I'm saying, what is the difference you see between individuals in that species? So what's really important about variation, which you already know, or you should know, is that it's the raw material for natural selection. So we're talking about evolution there. If you don't have variation, then you have no differences that would allow you to have a survival of the fittest version. So a Darwin natural selection. Every single thing that we look at, we're going to call a characteristic. So each of these bold words are important terms. So a characteristic is the thing that you look at, and then we look at what are the things inside that. So we say, right, okay, if the characteristic is hair color, you then say, right, is it blonde, brown, all that, okay, and all the other things that you could possibly imagine about any living thing, okay. Right, so we put variation into two different forms. We ask whether it is discrete or continuous. So discrete, obviously the one we're looking at now, means that you can put it into distinct categories, and to be honest, that is absolutely how I remember it. I go discrete is distinct categories. So what that means is that you can sort the people, the frogs, the leaves, whatever you're looking at, into particular groups, and there's no real blurry line about it. You just go, no, that's it. Okay, so for example, if you hold your thumb up, you can see whether your thumb goes straight up and down, or whether you have a kind of kink at the top of it, which is called a hitchhiker's thumb. I've got that one. Whether you can roll your tongue or not. I know you're all just checking. Okay, so that's a yes or no thing. And whether you have free or attached earlobes. So this is an attached earlobe here. You see it just goes straight down and into the side of your face. But this one, this has a kind of loop at the bottom. That's a free earlobe. This is more common. The free is more common than the attached. Some other things, okay, if you fold your arms right now, there will be a way that you fold your arms more preferential, whether it's a right side or a left side, right over left or left over right. And if you've tried going the other way, and it will feel very weird. So if we want to plot this, we're going to put this as a bar graph. So for example, this bar graph. Now this is actually not a good bar graph. If you're watching this, pause it, see if you can figure out what they are. Okay, here's our problems. This has no scale. This is it doesn't say number, so that's not okay. This has no title at the base, which is not good. This gap is bigger than this gap, which is not acceptable. And I would actually say as well, this bar is not the same width as other bars as well, so that's not okay either. Generally, it's not actually a very good graph. It gets the point across, but I would not be happy if you handed me that graph. It's not as clear as it should be. Your second form of variation is continuous variation. So this one, instead of it being a distinct group that I can say, right, okay, you fit into that category or the next category, that's it. This one falls over a range. So a range of values would be something where you had to measure it. So anything which you would have to take a tape measure out for or similar, we'll say it's continuous. So height is a very good example. Okay, you go from having very small to very tall people, and everything in between. If we want to graph that, we're not going to be able to use a bar graph because we've got a constant scale, so we're going to use a line graph. Okay, here's an example of a line graph. Can you pause it and see what's wrong? Okay, there's actually, I could argue there's two things wrong, but the issue is this scale here. I'm actually quite happy with using A, B, C, D. That's fine, but I have no E. And if this is a line graph, then it should be everything that's there. Okay, if you also are using a line graph, then this gap here should be the same as the gap to here, which is for B's to C's, so that's a bit dodgy too. It's not the best graph. I would have chosen to put this in differently. I might actually have decided to do this more correctly as a histogram, which is looking like a bar graph but with no gaps. That would have been maybe a better one to use. Okay, so if we're looking at the genetics of variation, we want to figure out exactly how these things can be passed on and how they are organised inside your genetic material. So our two types of variation are discontinuous. Now we know now that discontinuous is created if it's only on one gene. A single gene decides this. Now that doesn't mean that you can't have lots of different things on that gene. So you could have, because you can inherit different things from your mum, different things from your dad. But mono means one, genic means gene, so we're saying one gene is deciding what's going on. And that will give you distinct categories. For continuous, it's a little bit more complicated because for this one, we now know there's lots of genes. So it's no longer monogenic, and since biologists quite often cannot be bothered to count past one, we're going to call that polygenic, poly being many. And that will give you a range. So it's not that simple that we might have just one gene that's involved, which would be nice, or maybe many genes but they all work together, that's also fine. We now know also the environment can decide. So they can, well, not even decide, just impact. So it can change how your genes are finally expressed, so how much they actually produce. We know that some chemicals can affect it, and in particular this is involved in the polygenic stuff. So if you are malnourished when you're younger, then that will cause a difference in your height. So even though your genes might say that you should be a specific height, your environment has affected that. There's even some really quite interesting evidence about what happens to your grandparents even may affect what happens to your DNA. It's called epigenetics, which actually is more in the higher than the NAT5, but it's interesting. Okay, and that's the introduction.